Bienvenidos, Ushamdid, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners from the Spring 2023 semester taking the CTS-233 Section 400 Network Programmability course. This is the Cisco Networking Academy's DEVASC 200-901 Certification Exam Preparation course, and we now move on to Lab 3.4.6. Now, the title of the lab is Python Classes Review. However, in this lab, we're also taking a look at functions and methods. And so part 2 in this lab really just says, what's a function, what's a method, and it differentiates the two, right? So to kind of summarize what it's saying there, a function is a piece of code that can be executed on its own. And we've seen some examples of this already. So let's go ahead and transition over to our DEVASC virtual machine, and let's get into the Python interactive interpreter by typing in Python 3. Now, you'll see that I'm running 3.8.10. Remember, this is due to the sudo apt-get upgrade that was run on this system that I've been using here in these video tutorials. Yours probably says 3.8.2 if you have not done the upgrade. If you're following along and you're not using the DEVASC virtual machine, you can do this using python.org's idle, or if you've got a Mac and you have Python 3 installed, you can just simply type in Python 3 to get to the interactive interpreter here. All right, so really, we've seen functions already. Now, there's two types of functions. There are built-in functions, and print is a built-in function. And we've been using print a lot so far. We've also been using the type function. Now, we're going to see an error here because type is requiring at least one argument. But those are simply the built-in functions that are part of the Python standard libraries. Now, you can create your own functions. That's the second type of function that exists. So we've got built-in functions like print and type, and then maybe we want to write a function that does something that we want it to do, that maybe the standard libraries don't do. And we can create our own functions to do those things. Now, how is a function different from a method? Again, like I said, I can just simply type in print, and it's just going to print a blank line for me. Or we could provide an argument to print like hello. And print sees this argument right here, the string that we've provided, and it's simply going to print it. Now, methods, on the other hand, I've commented on this earlier, they're inextricably linked to the object class that they're defined in. So in other words, if I was to create a list, we'll call it my list, and let's just make it an empty list. Now, a method would be the append method, and we've seen this already as well, because there we go. We've got the open parentheses here, and append is anticipating that we're going to append, well, just append the number 1, right? So append is a method. Now, it looks just like a function. However, it's inextricably linked to the list object type or the list class. Because if I say type my list, we know that that's a list. So can I just simply run append on its own like this and say append 99? No, it's going to come back. Python says name error. I have no idea what you're talking about, because append isn't part of the Python standard library built-in functions. Append is a method. Now, where it becomes confusing is that methods look just like functions inside of the class definitions. In other words, the way that you construct and create a method in a class looks almost identical to a function when you create a function. But remember, that's the difference. Functions I can run on their own. Print, right? Boom, there it goes. It prints a blank line. Great. Methods have to be run in conjunction with the objects from the class in which they're defined. So let's go ahead now and let's dive in. This video is going to focus on part 3 in the lab, and we are focused solely on functions in this video. If you've already got a handle on functions and you don't think you need to see this, then I would move on to the next video, part 4, where we're going to start taking a look at classes and methods. So what about functions? Let's clear the screen right here. We're just going to say Control L, and I'm on a Mac when I did that. So a function is simply something that we can create that runs on its own. So I'm just going to create a function called define myfunc. Now, we have the open parent, close parents. Now, I could put what they refer to as parameters in here, or positional parameters, but you can, just like the print function can take no arguments, I'm going to create a function right here that takes no arguments. Now, remember, the ... is telling me, let's scoot in 4 spaces here, right? If we're indenting here, which we're going to, because again, remember, with Python, it's all about indentation that is defining and delimiting one block of code from the other. So what do I want my function to do? Well, when the function gets called, I'm just going to have the function print, whoops, we'll say, thanks for running my function, right? And so that's all this function is going to do. Now, you might not think that this has any value, but we're going to take an incremental approach and an inductive approach here where we're going to see a lot of different examples of what we would want to do when we're defining functions, or how we would define functions. So I'm going to hit enter, and then I'm going to hit enter again. And that's it. So my function's been defined. So if I use that dir built-in function with no arguments whatsoever, you can see that in the namespace that I'm currently working in right here, that my func has been defined. Now, let's go ahead and run it. Well, how do we run it? Well, you run it just like you run the print function, right? I'm just going to type in the name of the function because it's defined in the current namespace. So I say my func, and what does it do? It says, thanks for running my func, right? So thanks for running my function. Okay, great. Well, let's build on this now. So now I'm going to go ahead and we're going to redefine my function. Oops, sorry. We're going to redefine my function. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of what's called the docstring. Now, we've talked about docstrings before. And remember, it was when we were talking about the triple quotes. Oops, sorry. I didn't want to do that there. So we'll say define my func, and I'll say, we'll scoot in, and I'm going to put the docstring right in here, and we'll say, this is the docstring. Now, you might be wondering, what is the docstring used for? What's it supposed to be used for? Well, it's supposed to provide information about what this function does. So for right now, we're just going to say, this is the docstring, and I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to do the same thing here. We're just going to have it print something up. And we'll just say, hello from my func. Okay. So what if I say help? Now remember, if I say dir, you'll see that my func is defined in the current namespace. So if I was to use the help built-in function, I can say, show me some information about my function, right? So here is the help page, right? You can think of it as the help page, and there is the docstring. So if somebody that didn't know what your function was meant to do wanted to find out, they would simply say help in the name of your function, again, in this namespace that we're in. And I keep stressing that because remember, as soon as I do Control D or quit out of this, everything we've done is lost. And then we're going to transition over to VS Code, where we can create a file where the code is actually saved, and then we just rerun it. So again, help my function, that is where the docstring is going to show up. So if you create a function that maybe, takes in router names and is going to append those to a list of some kind, right? Maybe you want to describe in the docstring, hey, here's how you use the function that I've created. And again, function names follow the same rules as variable names, right? So they can't begin with a number. We can use upper lowercase letters. We can use the underscore, the dash, and I think I said numbers, 0 through 9. All right, so this is the beginning of functions. Well, now let's make this a little bit more interesting. In fact, back to the lab, it wants us to create a Python file where we define a function called myCity. And I should have done my camel case there with my function. Again, skip by it. And so now I'm going to introduce you to what we refer to in the function definition as parameters, right? Now, a parameter, think of it again, is just like a variable name, right? So it's kind of a placeholder that we're going to then pass into the function as a variable that we can use. So we're going to say city. So define myCity. Let's put a docstring in here. And so we can say this function takes a city name as an argument. And now I'm going to use the word argument here. I'm going to define the difference between arguments and parameters in just a second, because it's a technical semantic that we need to be aware of. Takes a city name as an argument and prints out that name. Pretty cool. All right, and so then we're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to print. And again, remember, city is just like a variable, and we've seen variables before. I live in, now they actually have a period at the end here, and they're going to use some concatenation with the plus sign because we're dealing with strings. And so let's say city, and then we want to do the period with no spaces. All right, so I think we're good there. Let me double check. All right, everything looks good. Our quotes match up. And so there's my function. So somebody comes along, they don't know what your function does, right, in your code, or maybe they've imported your code, and then take a look. The function takes a city name as an argument and prints out that name. All right, now again, we have right here the parameter variable name defined, and that's what we're going to be using in here. But I want you to watch what happens when we call my city. First, let's call my city with no arguments. And what do we see? Type error, missing one required positional argument. Now, when you call the function, like we're calling the function here, or if I called it in a script, which we're going to see shortly, when you call it, this is defined as the argument. So I'm going to say my city, Crofton, because I live in Crofton, Maryland. So I run the program, and it prints out I live in Crofton, Maryland. Now, it's important to point out when we invoke the function from the interactive interpreter here, when I call the function, that is considered technically an argument, right? When it gets passed, and I guess we'll draw a big long arrow here, when it gets passed up here to the function, it's a parameter that is getting passed in. And you can see that city is just representing whatever the name of the city is that I typed in. And then inside the function for the rest of its life, until it does what it's supposed to do and prints out I live in whatever the city is that was entered in, we're referring to it as city. And hopefully you see that, right? That whatever the name of the city is going to be represented by that parameter name inside of the function. But when we call the function, we're providing an argument. And you'll notice one positional argument not given when I tried to run or call the function myCity. All right, so let's clear the screen here. And hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's a semantic term, and sometimes you'll hear people use argument for both or parameter for both. And when you're talking about functions, it's commonly accepted that, yeah, I know what you're talking about there. So, all right, so here's how we call myCity. So then you know, they show you some examples here. So what if you lived in Austin, Texas? We could pass in Austin. What if you lived in, is it Tokyo, Tokyo, or if you live in Tokyo. Again, we're just providing an argument to the function. Just like when I run the print function, I can put an argument in here, right? Which is, it could be a string. It could be an integer. It could be a tuple, right? So it's the same concept. The difference is that we're making a function because the Python standard library doesn't have a function defined that's provided to us that allows me to say, hey, my city, and then print out my city, right? So we need this for our program. For whatever reason, we can go ahead and create our own function. Now, remember what I said. This is ephemeral. As soon as I quit and do Control-D, I am now back at the Linux CLI. Meaning if I was to say, oh, okay, well, I want to go back in there and practice with my function, right? And then, I'm sorry, not my function, my city. And I'm going to type my city name in here, and we're going to say Crofton, right? Remember, I quit out, and then I came back in. And it's going to say name error. My city's not defined. And I say, no, wait a minute, it was. No, it's gone, right? We quit, so it's gone. So what we would have to do is we would come to, if we wanted to keep the code and have the code run, we would want to go ahead and come into VS Code, right? And I'll do this in VS Code, and we're going to say we're going to create a new Python file. Here we go. And you would put some comments up here about maybe the author, what the program is going to do. But we want to define the function. And now this is going to become important here. Remember, we have to define the function before we call it or we invoke that function. So what I wouldn't do is call my city here and put in Crofton. And you can see it's got, my city's got that squiggly yellow underline underneath it already, right? And then come down and define the function down here, right? So this is not going to be a winning situation. We have to have the function defined before we invoke or call that function, and that should make logical sense. So let's do this. So I'm going to say define my city, and we are going to take in an argument, right, which goes into the function as a positional parameter. We're going to put our doc string in here. You can see VS Code knows, hey, he's getting ready to type a doc string in. Oops, sorry, and let's just say takes a single argument, which is a city name, and then we could put in parentheses string, right? So that's my doc string. So if somebody has no clue what this is going to do when they look at it, they can now look at it and say, look at it through the help and say, oh, okay, or they can look at the source code here. So now let's go ahead and then let's type in my city. Now you'll notice what's different about when we typed in my city this time. There is no yellow underlined squiggly thing underneath the calling of, I'm sorry, doing it wrong here. I forgot the print statement that we need. So let's put the print in here. But again, the same thing stands true. I live in, and then that's going to be that. And then we're going to concatenate the variable name, and then we're going to concatenate a period to the end of it. And there we go. Okay. So remember, it's all about the indentation, right? So out here, when I go to invoke my city, look at no yellow squiggly line underneath. And now I have it in the right place for you as well. So we'll throw Crofton in here, and we'll throw my city, oops, sorry, my city, because now that my city is defined, this program knows that it exists, and it knows what it's going to be calling Tokyo, and then we'll put the last one in here just for completeness, my city, and we're going to say Salzburg, and I think that might be in Germany maybe. All right, so there we go. There's our entire program with our function that's defined. And again, if the program that you're creating is going to require people to, enter in the name of their city and you want it to print out, then this is what we would want to do. So let's go ahead. You can see here, it's telling us, hey, we've got one unsaved file. So I'll say file and save. And, oh, that's right. Remember, sometimes the save as dialog will open behind the VS Code. And I'm just going to call this mycity.py. And I think that was the name they wanted me to give it. And they actually wanted to go with mycity.py. All right. So we save it. Well, let's go ahead and run it. So run without debugging. We get the console down here, and there you go. That's what the output would be. I live in Crofton, I live in Austin, I live in Tokyo, I live in Salzburg. Now, we could also copy this code here, and I think we'd probably, with such a small amount of code, and okay, let's do this. We'll say edit copy, because it's acting a little strange there. And if we were to come back here, and I was to paste all this code in, hopefully it takes it. No, it doesn't. It didn't like the the print line. Oh, because I had an extra space, extra new line in there in the, in the VS Code, right? So that extra line that I dumped in here, if we were to pull that back, let's recopy this. And the question is, can I copy this? And hopefully this is going to do what we think it's going to do. We've got our 4 spaces in there, indicated by the 4 dots. Come back over to the interactive interpreter, click paste. Aha, much better. And there you go. And you can see that it's going to work in the interactive interpreter as well. And so now, so for the lab, that kind of like wraps up the lab with the functions. They show you a really easy example. So now what we're going to do is we're going to dive in much deeper into functions here. And I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that get asked a lot about functions. So let's clear the screen. So now I'm going to go ahead and say my func again. We're going to create my function here, and we're going to say def my function. We're going to open this up, and we're not going to have any arguments passed in for right now. We could put a doc string, but we're not going to do that. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. Excuse me. And we're going to have this do num1 gets the value of 3 plus 4. Right? Now that's just like a basic variable name, and we're assigning it the value with a single equal sign, meaning assigning the value of 3 plus 4. And what I want to do is down here, I'm going to say print num1. Because what I want to show you is that when you're inside of the function, think of it as you're inside of this totally hermetically sealed little bubble that is its own namespace. So watch what happens when I say my func. I call the function. And the function prints 7, right? Because 3 plus 4 is 7. Well, what happens when I say, oh, okay, well, print up the value for num1? Name error. So wait a second, let's say dir. Because my function is defined here, right? It's my function. The function is in the namespace that I'm currently in, which is the main interactive interpreter namespace. That function is defined. What is not defined is num1. Where is num1 defined? Yeah, it's inside of this function. And so the functions, unless you tell them otherwise, are going to work as if they're in their own little bubble, their own little namespace, which is why even if I type num1, we don't see that. Well, yeah, you might be saying, okay, well, wait a second. What if you said num1? Well, we'll hold on that for a second. So that's what I want you to see, is that variables defined inside of the function, unless we return those values to the calling namespace, the calling environment, which is this main namespace here, we're not going to see those variables because, again, they're locally defined in the function namespace, which is like this little sealed off bubble, right? Think of it as working, it's a little panic room that it's working in. All right, let's clear the screen here, and let's go ahead and say define my function. We're going to redefine it here. We're not going to have any arguments. We don't need any. And we're going to do the following. So num1 gets 3 plus 3. We'll change it up a little bit here. And now I'm going to, oops, sorry, I didn't want to do that. Hit it by mistake. So let's call this back. In the interactive interpreter, I'm going to say return num1. And when you use return inside of a function, that is it. The function is done running. And to prove this, I'm going to put a print statement after it. You will never see this print statement. And the reason that you're not going to see that is when return is used in a function like I just used it, and we want to return some value, that is it. The life of the function is over. And this says return back to the main namespace, or return back to the caller. Who called me? We're going to return back to that namespace. Think of return as like the break keyword inside of a while loop. If you remember, when you use the break keyword inside of a while loop, that is it. You're out of that while loop. It's game over. Return is the same thing. So let me hit enter twice. And ironically, it says on the Mac keyboard, it says returned. I didn't want to use that to make confusion here. So there's our function, right? So what happens when I call my function? We see 6, right? Because it's going to return the num1 value. If I was to take this out of there, right, we wouldn't see anything. Don't believe me? Let's take a look here. Let's say define my function. We're going to say num1 gets 3 plus 3. I'm not going to return it. Let's put the print function in there because you notice we didn't see it here, right? Because the return came before it. Now when we put the return, we remove the return statement, when I call my function, are we going to see 6, you will never see this print statement, or are we only going to see the print statement? We don't return anything from that function. We only have the declaration of num1 equals 3 plus 3, and then print, you will never see this print statement. And so the only thing we're going to see here is that print statement. That's it. So let's take this to the next logical step. Okay, well, what if I wanted to add 2 numbers together? I want to create a function that I can call whenever that's just going to take 2 numbers and add those numbers together. Well, let's create that function. So we're going to say define, and I'll just say add. Now, just like we had city before with my city, what are we taking in here? Well, we're taking in, again, you could look at it as parameters. We could, you could use arg1, arg2, but I'm going to say num1, comma, and then, oops, sorry, I said num3, num2. So again, I can pick whatever names I feel are going to be most representative and make the most sense here. So we're going to pass 2 numbers in, num1 and num2, into the body of this function. And we could put a doc string in here, right? And describe, okay, this function adds together 2 numbers, right? Oops, sorry, I didn't want that. And then we're going to go 2 numbers, 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, so how would this work? Well, when you add 2 things together, what do you get? Well, you get the sum, right? The sum of 2 numbers. So I'm going to say the sum is going to be assigned the value of num1 plus num2. Simple enough, right? Okay. And let's print out, and actually we're not going to print anything. So if I quit right here and hit enter, all that's going to do is take in 2 numbers, add them together, and assign the value to sum. Now, we want that value for our program, so we would want to return the sum. If we want the value from the function, we have to return that value, or else we're not going to get it, right? So the beauty of this is now I can just simply say add, that number, comma, that number, right? And that's what those 2 numbers add up to, because it's returning that. So I can say add, that number, comma, that number, and then we got to put the closing parent on there, right? A little bit easier so that we can look at that, at first blush and say, oh yeah, okay, that's correct, right? That actually works. And so this is returning the value to us. Now, in a larger program, let's take the next logical step here. Yeah, it returns the value, but what happens when I say sum? Yeah, it comes back as built-in function sum, because again, this is you can think of it as like a keyword. So, but what if I wanted to capture that value in the name, in the main namespace? Because right now, yeah, it returns it and I see it, but again, it's once it prints up, here's your sum, that's it, it's done, right? The value that was printed, we don't have that available to us in this program anymore. So here's how you capture a return value from a function. How do we do that? Well, we simply create a variable name in the main namespace here. And I'm going to call it, we'll say it's my sum. I don't want to conflict with the other sum there. So my sum is going to get the value, or be assigned the value of whatever this function returns. And so we'll say add 33, comma 33, which we should get 66. So, but does it print out the value? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't print it out like it did up here, because what are we telling it to do with the value? The value that's returned, hey, we're going to capture this, put it into the MySum box, right? The variable that represents that value. We've got this new object here called MySum. So what is the value that MySum points to? It points to 66. Well, what is 66, right? Let's check this out. Is that a string? Is that an integer? What got returned to us? Yeah, we got returned an integer, right? And so this is how you can capture the values that are being returned from your function. So now let's take it to another next logical step. And that might be, okay, so what if I don't know how many arguments are going to be entered in, right? Maybe you want to prompt for, and let's clear our screen here, and we're going to say define, and I'm going to say, we'll just call it my buddies, right? So the function is going to be my buddies. Well, I don't know how many buddies I might have at any given time. Maybe I'm going to remember 3 or 4 names and type those in. Maybe I'm going to remember a whole bunch of names and type those in. But here's the thing. If you don't know how many names are going to be typed in, we can use that convention right there, *args. And what that represents is an unknown number of arguments. In other words, I could type 3 things in, and that is going to take all 3 things. I could type 50 things in, and that *args is going to take all of those arguments in. Now, we'll skip the docstring for now, but here's the key. Since I've passed in all these parameters, I am going to have to iterate over those parameters to do what I need it to do. Now, I'm going to do a for loop here. And so actually, let's pick something different. So I'm going to say for, and remember in the for loop, this is going to be like a variable name placeholder that I'm going to use. So I'm going to say for buddies in args, right? So remember, buddies, I could have put for friends. I could have put for my BFFs. I could have put BFFs, right? This is just a placeholder that I'm going to refer to later on when I want things to be printed up. So for buddies in args, and this represents that, right? So for buddies in args, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. What is it that we want to do? Well, I'm going to print dude, you, and let's see how we're going to do this here. Dude, you, and I'll do, we'll leave it there, and then I'll concatenate we'll concatenate, we want buddies, right? That placeholder, dude, you, and then we're assuming it's going to be the name, like Bob, Steve, whatever. And then we're going to concatenate that with are my BFF. All right. Keeping this function hip and current. All right. So that function right there will take in as arguments as many names as I can type in, and it's going to print out for each of those names that statement, dude, you, Steve, are my BFF. So let's see what that looks like, right? So here we go. Let's call the function my buddies, and let's put in some names. So Doug, John, John, Todd. All right, I don't have a lot of friends, I guess. So we'll leave it at that. I'll say Jennifer. Okay, so that's my list of, very short list of buddies, right? So I'm going to pass this in. Now remember, these down here, when the function is invoked, these are arguments. These arguments are going to be passed in because, again, we don't know how many friends I'm going to be typing in here. *args is going to take each of those. And then I can iterate over them. Let's see what happens when we call that function. Dude, you, Doug, are my BFF. You, John, Todd, Jennifer. So hopefully that gives you a great idea as to how you might leverage the *args, for example, right? Like you don't know how many arguments are going to be typed in. Now, there's also this other convention that we're going to take a look at right now, called, and we'll define, we'll call this one BFFs. BFFs. All right, so here's our new function. We're going to define, 2 asterisks kwargs, right? So this is keyword, and this is what it stands for. The kwargs stands for keyword arguments. So I could send a list of key value pairs into this function. Again, an unknown number of key value pairs can be sent in here. And here's how we would deal with this. I would say for, and again, since I'm using key value, let's say key comma, value in kwargs dot items, right? And with a dictionary, I don't know if we saw this or not, but that items, this would be considered a method with a dictionary with key value pairs that would just list out the items. And then we'll need the colon there. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to just simply print out again. And, you know, dude, you, and then let me make sure I don't mess this up here. And we're going to concatenate value, right? So for key, value in kwargs.items, we're going to print out, make sure I get this right, value, and then we're going to concatenate to the following that says, what am I, dude, you, Bob, and then, oh wait, are my BFF. There we go. All right. So what is this going to do? Well, it's going to do something similar. However, let's take a look at how we pass in things, or how we invoke for the BFF's function. What are we passing in? Well, remember we said keyword argument. So kwarg1 gets the value of Todd. And then we separate that from kwarg2. And that's the key. And then the value it points to is Jennifer. And then kwarg3. And that's going to get the value of Robert. And then kwarg4 is the key. And the value is going to be John, right? And then this is how we invoke or call the kwargs. When we're working with key value pairs, we're going to hit enter. And again, the result is the same, but this is a different way to pass in key value pairs. Okay, so that allowed us to do unknown number of key value pairs, an unknown number of arguments. And so this is probably a good stopping spot, right? We've covered a ton of ground here with respect to functions in Python. So this wraps up part 2 and 3. When we dive into part 4, we're now going to start to take a look at classes. And remember, a class is just like an object factory. It's going to pump out as many objects as we tell it to create, right? All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this has clearly defined how you would do a function and how we would use functions in our programs. And now it's your turn to get out there and experiment. Again, thanks so much for watching. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.